It's early spring and your lawn looks great, green even and freshly seeded right along the back fence where you spent an entire Saturday on your knees, pressing soil over bulbs you'd waited months to plant. Two birds land near the flower bed. They're small, almost decorative, the kind of visitors you'd normally smile at, or maybe even pull your phone out to photograph. So you go back inside. 3 days later, that seeded patch looks totally torn open, not just eaten excavated, like something has been digging, methodically, just beneath the surface in places you can't quite see. The birds are still there, still small, still, somehow, looking completely harmless. But something underneath your lawn has already changed. And honestly, it started the exact moment you stopped watching. Here's what most gardeners never realize. The damage you can actually see is almost never the damage that matters. You notice the missing seedling, the overturned mulch, the scattered dirt right by the flower bed. You blame the wind. You blame squirrels. Or you just blame bad soil, bad timing, or bad luck. But beneath every one of those small, visible disruptions, something else is happening that you can't see at all. It's a slow, quiet unraveling of the actual biological system keeping your garden alive. Soil isn't just dirt, It's a living network of fungal threads, bacteria, and root connections working together to move nutrients between plants. Ecologists call it the soil microbiome, and it's arguably more important to a healthy yard than sunlight or water. Disturb it enough in the wrong places, at the wrong depth, and plants that look totally fine on the surface can quietly start starving from below. And the birds responsible for that disturbance? They're not the aggressive, obvious pests you'd expect. They're the ones that look completely innocent. The ones people put out special feeders for. The ones you see on calendars and greeting cards. That's the part that should kind of unsettle you. Because the real damage in your garden isn't being done by anything menacing. It's being done by creatures you've been quietly welcoming in for years, without ever realizing what they were doing underneath your feet the entire time. By the end of this, I promise you won't ever look at a harmless garden visitor the same way again. Here's why this actually matters. For most home gardeners, a lawn or a flower bed isn't just landscaping. It's hours of grueling labor. It's real money spent on soil, bulbs, seeds, and tools. It's a quiet, personal investment in something meant to grow, season after season, into something better. And when that investment fails, when perennials just stop coming back, when the grass grows in weird patches, or when a garden that used to thrive suddenly struggles for no visible reason, most people never trace it back to the real cause. They blame the weather. Or worse, they blame themselves. But in countless documented cases, the true culprit has been hiding in plain sight the entire time. Small, familiar, feathered, and completely unsuspected. Look, understanding these 5 species isn't about learning to hate birds. It's about finally getting what's actually happening beneath your lawn so you can stop losing the exact thing you worked so hard to build. Let's open the case, one species at a time. Before we go beneath the surface, literally, one quick thing. If you've ever wondered why a healthy-looking garden suddenly starts declining for no clear reason, you're going to want to see what's coming, because this goes deeper than most people expect. Subscribe now, because the deeper we go into this investigation, the stranger and more useful it gets. A healthy-looking lawn is one of the most convincing illusions in nature. From above, green grass reads as success, as balance, as a system working exactly the way it's supposed to. But soil scientists will tell you that visual health and structural health are two totally different things. A lawn can look completely flawless on the surface while the root systems underneath are already fractured, thinning, or totally disconnected from the nutrient network that's supposed to keep them alive. This matters because most garden damage doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive as a dramatic, visible event. It arrives as a slow erosion. A few disturbed roots here, a shredded patch of turf there, a bulb pulled just slightly out of position, each one small enough to dismiss, but honestly, cumulative enough to eventually collapse an entire section of otherwise healthy growth. And here's the part most homeowners never connect. Birds foraging for insects, grubs, and larvae don't just peck at the surface. Many species actually probe several centimeters right into the topsoil, disturbing root hairs and beneficial fungal networks that plants completely depend on to absorb water and nutrients. A single bird doing what looks like ordinary foraging can disrupt root systems across a surprisingly wide radius. It's totally invisible from a standing height, but devastating at the scale of a root system. Multiply that by repeated visits from multiple species across an entire season, and you start to understand why gardens that looked fine in April are suddenly struggling by July with no obvious explanation. This is the blind spot right at the heart of backyard gardening. We watch for chewed leaves, missing petals, obvious signs of pest damage. But we almost never watch what's happening 2 inches beneath the mulch, where the real war for your garden's survival is actually being fought. 4 species are responsible for the worst of it. And the first one? Well, it's been quietly shredding lawns for longer than most gardeners have even owned their homes. If your lawn has ever developed strange, shallow holes, overnight small punctures, evenly spaced, like something methodically tested the ground before deciding where to dig honestly, that's not random damage. That's a European starling doing exactly what it evolved to do. Starlings feed using this thing called open bill probing. They shove their beak straight into the soil, and then they force it open to widen the hole and search for grubs, larvae, and insects underground. It's wildly effective for finding food. But it's also pretty destructive to your grass because the technique physically snaps the root systems the turf depends on to stay anchored and alive. A single starling will probe dozens of times in one feeding session. A flock in starlings almost always travel in flocks can turn a healthy section of lawn into a perforated, root-severed mess in under an hour. And the worst part, the damage often doesn't even show up until days later when the grass quietly starts yellowing and dying from below. Here's the detail that usually surprises people. Starlings aren't even native to North America. Every single starling on the continent traces back to about 100 birds released in Central Park in 1890. In just over a century, that population ballooned to over 200 million birds. Now, turfgrass damage from their foraging is a documented headache for residential lawns, golf courses, and farms all across the country. What makes them so brutal on a cultivated garden is that they just don't hesitate. Native ground foragers tend to be cautious, backing off when the soil is tough or compacted. Starlings? They don't have that instinct at all. They'll just keep probing the exact same weakened spot, widening the damage instead of avoiding it. That's why lawns hit by starlings usually show damage in tight, worsening clusters rather than spread out evenly. So the next time you see a small flock of starlings marching methodically across your yard, beaks dipping rhythmically into the grass, just realize what you're actually watching. It's not foraging in that cute, gentle way people like to imagine. It's structural demolition, one root at a time. And get this, it happens on a schedule. Starlings love to hit the exact same feeding grounds day after day once they find a good spot. Meaning if a flock hits your lawn once, statistically, it's way more likely to get hit again within the same week. The damage just compounds faster than the grass can recover, especially in wetter months when grub populations spike and the starlings come running. And honestly, that's only the first of 4 operations already underway beneath your garden. Somewhere underneath your flower bed, a bulb you planted last fall is just missing. Not eaten on the surface, not visibly disturbed. It's simply gone, leaving behind just a slight dip in the dirt to show it was ever there. That's the work of the scrub jay. And honestly, it's one of the most quietly destructive habits in the whole backyard bird world. Scrub jays are heavy-duty hoarders. Just like their blue jay cousins, they like to stash food for later. But while a lot of birds hide seeds in tree bark or leaf litter, scrub jays specifically look for loose, worked-up soil. Why? Because it's way easier to dig into and easier to remember where they put it. Which means your freshly planted flower beds, veggie patches, and bulb gardens look like absolute prime real estate to a scrub jay. It's basically a storage unit with free rent. Researchers studying how corvids cache food have found that scrub jays can remember the exact spot of thousands of individual hiding places. They even organize them by what they hid and when. So once a jay figures out your flower bed is a good spot, it doesn't just stop by once. It comes back over and over, week after week, treating your garden like a long-term pantry it plans to raid whenever it gets hungry. The damage kind of stacks up from both sides. First, the jays dig up whatever bulbs or seeds are already in there just to make room for their own stuff, often ruining what you spent time planting. Then, they drop their own items in nuts, seeds, sometimes even pieces of carrion right into your dirt. That introduces random organic material that messes with root growth and soil chemistry in ways most gardeners never trace back to the actual culprit. What makes this so annoying is just the timing. Scrub jays tend to cache stuff most aggressively in the fall. That's the exact same time people are out there planting spring bulbs. The two habits overlap almost completely, meaning the birds can wipe out days of your hard work in a single afternoon of digging. If your flower bed has ever looked weirdly messed up for no obvious reason, dirt pushed up in little piles, bulbs gone without a trace, you weren't imagining things. You were looking at someone else's pantry, and you didn't even know you built it. And it gets weirder. If a jay can't find its hidden food, maybe because you added mulch, or moved things around, or replanted, it won't just give up. It'll often try again right next to the old spot, digging a fresh hole just inches away. That's why some of the most frustratingly ruined flower beds look like the damage is all clustered together in tight little patches instead of being spread out across the yard. Young seedlings are fragile by design. Soft stems, shallow roots, barely even anchored into the soil, which honestly makes them almost a little too perfect for one of the house sparrow's favorite hobbies, tearing up tender green growth for food and nesting material. House sparrows aren't picky. Beyond seeds and bugs, they love the soft shoots of young plants. Gardeners know this pain all too well. Lettuce, beans, flowering annuals getting wiped out just days after sprouting, way before the poor plant has a fighting chance. Here's the part that hurts the most. House sparrows don't just eat the leaves. They'll often pull whole seedlings right out of the dirt while they're foraging, snapping that fragile little root-to-soil connection. You walk out to your garden bed the next morning, and your seedlings aren't even eaten. They're just toppled over, lying there on the surface with their roots completely exposed, totally doomed. And because house sparrows hang out in tight communal colonies near reliable food, a single flower bed found by one bird usually means trouble for the whole neighborhood. Wildlife folks tracking these colonies have noticed flocks coming back to the exact same garden beds year after year. To them, your hard work is just a predictable menu item. There's a quieter cost too. Sparrows love stripping soft plant material leaves, stems, fine root fibers for their nest linings. So even if they aren't eating your seedlings, they might still wreck them just building a cozy home, usually during those crucial weeks when spring growth is at its most fragile. So when an entire row of seedlings mysteriously gives up the ghost, not eaten, not diseased, just dead or lying loose on the ground, it's usually not bad soil or bad timing. It's just a small, unassuming bird doing what generations of colony life taught it to do, one fragile root at a time. And because that behavior gets passed down, if your garden loses seedlings to sparrows this spring, honestly, you're probably going to see the exact same thing happen next year. The local fledglings just inherit the habit right along with the territory. Common grackles don't try to hide like jays or sparrows. They're loud, they're big, and you can't really miss them. But the real damage they do happens underground, way more subtle than you'd expect from such a noisy bird. Grackles are aggressive ground foragers. They use those long, sturdy bills to dig deep into soil and turf looking for grubs, worms, and beetle larvae. Unlike starlings, which mostly poke around near the surface, grackles dig deep. They can mess with root systems several inches down, way past where most gardeners would ever think to look for bird trouble. This depth is what makes grackles so uniquely destructive to established perennials and shrubs. Seedling damage is usually obvious and immediate, right? But grackle root disturbance often shows up weeks later. A plant that looked totally healthy suddenly starts wilting, even with plenty of water and sun, and by the time you actually notice it above ground, the underground damage is usually past the point of fixing. Grackles also move in big, coordinated flocks, especially in late summer and fall, where dozens or even hundreds of birds sweep across open ground together. A single flock working a garden bed disturbs way more soil than any lone bird ever could. They take what should be minor, isolated damage and turn it into widespread root destruction in just one feeding session. Soil ecologists have noticed something else too. This kind of deep, repeated digging messes with the fungal networks that many perennial roots rely on to absorb nutrients. So the harm isn't just to the physical roots they bump into. It spreads to the whole underground network, keeping those plants alive, loud, obvious, easy to spot, and somehow still the most underestimated root threat in the backyard. That's mostly because the loud bird and the quiet damage don't seem like they should go together. You see a grackle strutting across the grass, and you figure whatever it's doing must be just as loud and obvious. But the worst damage happens in quick, efficient bursts of digging, sometimes lasting only seconds per hole, leaving behind a tiny patch of disturbed dirt, and you won't even notice it until the plant above it gives up entirely. 4 species, 4 completely different methods, and all of them working right beneath the surface of that exact same lawn. Here's where the pieces start connecting. Because these 4 species, the turf-shredding starlings, the bulb-hoarding scrub jays, the seedling-toppling sparrows, and the deep-digging grackles rarely operate in true isolation. Watch a struggling garden closely enough across an entire season, and a disturbing pattern emerges. The damage doesn't happen all at once. It happens in layers, piling on top of each other, with each species unknowingly building on the mess the last one left behind. A starling loosens the soil, while a starling digs into the soil for grubs, right? And that loosened dirt just makes it easier for a scrub jay to come along and cache its food. Suddenly, that patch is softer, a little less stable, and honestly, it's basically an invitation for sparrows looking for exposed roots. Before you know it, the grackles show up, digging even deeper and finishing the job, cutting right through whatever root connections were still holding things together. Here's the thing, none of these birds are coordinating. They don't even know the others exist. It just looks designed this slow, compounding erosion of the exact biological structure your garden needs to survive. And it all happens in a sequence that no single visit could ever explain. And honestly, the timeline is the most unsettling part. Ecologists studying suburban soil health have found that this kind of multi-species disturbance can take a thriving garden bed and structurally compromise it in just a single growing season. And the worst part is, you won't see a single obvious sign until the plants up top finally just give up. There's one final number that really puts this scale into perspective. Before we get there, though, think about this. None of these birds are actually considered garden pests. Extension offices don't warn you about them. Pest control companies don't touch them. They're just background birds. Common, familiar, entirely unsuspected. And that's exactly why this kind of damage goes undiagnosed for so long. Gardeners spend seasons testing soil pH, tweaking watering schedules, changing fertilizers, chasing every single explanation except the birds quietly hopping across the lawn every morning. Here it is. In studies of suburban garden decline, researchers have found that root and soil disturbance from foraging birds can account for measurable drops in soil microbial activity of over 40% in heavily affected areas. That is a massive disruption, enough to seriously wreck a plant's ability to absorb water and nutrients, even if every other growing condition is completely perfect. 40%, not from disease, not from bad soil, not from anything you did wrong. Just 4 small, familiar species, the kind nobody would ever suspect of doing structural harm, quietly probing, digging, caching, and foraging their way through the exact network keeping your garden alive. You didn't build a peaceful, decorative sanctuary. You built an open, cultivated resource. Soft soil, dense nutrients, easy digging, and nature responded the exact way it always does when that kind of resource pops up, layer by layer, bird by bird, until the damage beneath the surface finally becomes impossible to ignore above it. And this is the part people miss. The very qualities that make a garden beautiful to you: loose, nutrient-rich soil, tender new growth, carefully spaced beds, are the exact same things that make it completely irresistible to every single species you just met. So go back to that early spring morning, the perfect lawn, the 2 small, harmless-looking birds hanging out near the flower bed, that seeded patch that looked, just 3 days later, quietly torn open from beneath. You know now there was never anything random about it. There was a starling probing for grubs, a scrub jay building a pantry beneath your bulbs, a sparrow toppling seedlings it never even meant to eat, a grackle finishing what the others started, inches below where you'd ever think to look. Your garden was never simple. It was a battleground, fought root by root beneath a surface that never once stopped looking perfect. And honestly, understanding that changes how you'll walk past it every single morning from now on. So here's my question for you. Has your garden ever declined for no clear reason, only for you to realize months later what was actually happening beneath the surface? Tell me in the comments which of these species you think has been at work in your yard. And if this changes how you'll look at your garden tomorrow morning, make sure you're subscribed. Here's a concise, SEO-optimized YouTube description tailored to your wildlife video.